So Luke 14, starting in verse 7. Now what we have today, we've been going through parables. And we actually had, you'll notice it says the parables of the great banquet, because Jesus tells two stories. He's at a banquet, he's at a dinner party when he says all of this. And so he uses that setting to give what at first sounds like just some really good advice. Okay? And really, if you look at what he says in both of these stories, there really is good, practical advice. So we're going to look at it from that point of view, but it goes much deeper than that, right? And I'm going to plug this once or twice. We're going to have lunch right after so that we can put all of this into practice, right? So he's talking about eating food. We're going to eat food. And where are you going to sit and all that stuff? Because, it can be kind of awkward. You don't know where to sit. You go to a wedding. If they don't have assigned seats, where do you sit? Personally, I always pick the very back of the room, farthest away from I like to call it the captain's table, where if you go on a cruise, they have the captain's table. I never want to sit at those tables. So various events, sometimes I have to sit at those kinds of tables at the front of the room where you're on one side and the whole room is on the other side of the table. And I just find that to be like the single most awkward thing on the planet. In fact, when I became secretary at Kiwanis, Deborah's laughing at me. She knows. She's seen me do this. When I became the secretary at Kiwanis, I said, I will be secretary on one condition. And usually, if anybody says yes to being secretary of the club, you get whatever you ask for because they want you to do it. And I said, on one condition, I get to sit with everybody else. I don't want to be on a captain's table. I don't want to do that. I want to eat, a couple of years of sitting all by myself. So I got it. I think it changed forever. It's great. But it can be awkward. You go in and you don't know where to sit. Sometimes you go to a wedding, your friends on both sides. Whose side do you sit on? I don't think it. I'm going to be upfront with you. I don't think it matters. But tradition says, that it can matter. And I don't know how you detect the rules on this. I'm always thankful when there's an usher who just says, here, there's a seat down here, and you don't have to think about it. I like it better when you go to a wedding and they have all those tables with the name placards. So that then I don't have to worry about it. I just find out where in the boondocks they put James, and I'm happy about that. As long as I don't have to sit with my neck like this to see everything, I'm happy. Fine. But for some people, these things really, really, really matter. And I don't say that like that's better or worse. Some of this is just personality stuff. But for some people, this really matters. And they want to make sure, sometimes it's conscientious, they want to make sure they're sitting in the right place. They don't want to offend anybody. They don't want to take anybody's spot. So what do? Good for you. God has advice. Jesus is at a dinner, and he says, let me talk to you about where you sit. And I'm sure that some of the people were sitting in the room going, I've heard Jesus tell a lot of things. I've heard about the things that Jesus says, and he's a little bit of a bomb thrower every now and then. He's going to talk to us about where to sit. Yes, he is. And this is where he starts. Now, he told a parable to those who were invited. When he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, now you've already got a little bit, we're going to come back to context, but you got a little bit of a hint there, didn't you? When he saw how they had been jockeying around for just the right seat. When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come to you and say to you, give your place to this person, and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. Is that good advice? I think that's actually really good advice. So that's what Jesus says. Then he goes on, but when you are invited, what do then? Go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then, how many of you just heard the Jeffersons, right? Moving on up. Move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So there's a principle that's involved here that is far deeper than where you sit. But let's just look at it superficially first. He says you go to a wedding and you don't know where to sit, and you might be tempted to say, I've known them for a long time. I'm a good friend of the family. I'm this, I'm that, or I'm the mayor, or I'm this, or I'm that, and so I should surely have a seat at this soiree, because it's got to be a soiree if you're fooling yourself, right? It can't just be a dinner. And so I am going to go to this and I'm going to sit at the table. And you find the best place that you can get right up there front and center. Maybe even you just assume you're at the captain's table and you just go find you a seat up there. And you can be your shirt and lift the fork and drink out of the glass so you can't be moved, right? He says that's the wrong way to go about this, Holy Ghost. Do not do this. Instead, and I understand, for me, just go back to what I just said about licking the fork. How many of you did that as children? I'm curious. Don't raise hands because nobody will sit next to you at the fellowship anymore. But, some of you as children, especially if you had several siblings, you did this, right? I've known people who would lick the plate and then say, that's my seat. Oh, yeah, well, I'm sitting there as they pile into, well, I licked the plate. And they weren't kidding, and you're calling shotgun and all this stuff. Don't be like children, fighting over getting the best seat. That's a kid's thing. Like Paul said, when I was a child, I thought like a child and I acted like a child. And when I became an adult, I put childish ways behind me. This is kind of what Jesus is saying. That's all childish. Don't be calling shotgun at the wedding banquet. Instead, go find a humble place to sit. And there's a bonus, right? If you do that, you might actually get to move up. There's some principles involved here. The first one here, and I think Downton Abbey is quite appropriate for the setting of this parable. And I like that expression. I don't know what was going on there, but that's what happens when they tell you to move your seat. I think that's what that is. Anyway, never assume, period. I should just put a period there, right? Just never assume. That's really the best way to go. You see somebody that you're not sure, I'm going to sit there, but I think they may be going to sit there. Don't assume that you're more important than them. Don't assume you're more honorable than them. Acquiesce. Let them have a seat. Just make no assumptions about how wonderful and great everybody must think you are at the dinner. Just another way of saying, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. So just never assume that you're more important than everybody else. That seems practical, but it's also biblical. It's really the core principle behind everything in this parable. Don't get full of yourself and assume that you're more important than everybody else at the table. Instead, Paul says in Romans 12:10, honor others above yourself. Instead of thinking about where am I going to sit, pull the seat out for somebody else. Instead of thinking, can I have that seat that's right in the middle of everything? Let somebody else grab that seat. Instead of sitting at the head of the table, let somebody else sit at the head of the table. Just give somebody else that spot. And Jesus says, who knows? You might actually find out. That seat was yours. Then you look good. But the other way, there's no way to look good when they have to move you down. I got to share this story. I'm getting ready for another trip to Cambodia. I leave in just a few short weeks. And the last time that I went, I bought my tickets way ahead. I did this time too. I like to buy my plane tickets as far ahead as I can, still get a good deal. And one of the reasons I do that is because, nowadays you go on and you reserve the actual particular seat yourself. And you can see where it is in the plane and you get that. Sometimes I will pay a little bit extra to get a seat that's not in the middle. The middle for me is, anxiety inducing. It's a traumatic experience. I sat next to this skinny German on a Russian flight one time, and he had elbows that were 4 miles long, And I had the middle seat, in the middle of five seats across, in the middle of the plane, middle seat, middle of the plane. He was next to me, and he did this the whole time, My grandmother, when she retired, she was a very prim and proper woman, but when she retired, she decided it was okay to throw her leg over the arm of the chair. And so she would just start doing that somewhere around 70-something. And I asked her about it once, and she was like, well, I used to have to be polite. And there went that leg, right over the leg of the chair. Well, this guy thought he was already in his 70s and could do this. And it's just the entire flight. This was like a 10-hour flight. I think it was Dallas to Frankfurt. And he just keeps doing all that. So ever since, I do not like a middle seat. Okay, and not only was it a middle seat, it was a middle seat at the bulkhead with the wall right in front of you. So not even a lot of room. Terrible. I don't like to be cramped. Give me an emergency exit. I'll help people off the plane. It's worth it. Please. So I had months ahead chosen all of my seats. I had to pay a little extra to do, not a lot, but a little bit extra to do that. And this is a long trip. I was going from New York to Cleveland to LA to Guangzhou, China to Phnom Penh, Cambodia. It was 44 hours altogether, all the trips and layovers and all of that stuff. Won't be that long this time, but all of that. And then I'm on my return flight, which was even longer. I think it was 46 or 48 hours, the same route all the way back. And it's the last flight. How tired are you of planes by this point? It's the last flight. And I go to get my seat, and there's a person in my seat. And I had reserved a window seat on this flight. I really prefer the aisle, but somebody already had the aisle, so because that's just even more room, right? And I would rather get up when somebody else needs out. And this is kind of this principle, I would rather be the one who's asked, because I'll gladly get up and let you in and out. That's not a problem. I don't care. It doesn't bother me. But I don't want to have to bother somebody else. So I'd rather sit at the aisle, but I couldn't. The aisle person wasn't there yet. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, but, excuse me, who here enjoys having to do that? I hate having to do that. This for me is actually more anxiety. And I'm not a real anxious person. But that's more anxiety than the security clearance and all that kind of stuff at the airport. It really bugs me to have to do that. But I did. I said, I'm sorry, but you're in my seat. Of course, I'm thinking maybe she has the aisle seat because it was 3 across and it was ABC. And I thought, well, maybe she actually has seats, so she actually has the better seat. And I said, I'm sorry, but that's my seat. Da, da, da. And she said, no, it's CBA. Well, I'm standing here on a plane, okay? At my height, do you know where the little designators for all the seats are? They're right here while you're standing in the aisle talking about where your seat is. And I'm like, no, I think that's ABC. Woo! I really did just make myself dizzy. I'm not even playing it. And so I said, no, that's A and B, and then this one is C. And so I'm thinking again, I'm actually helping you. This is going to be a way better seat. Oh, well then. She gets up, not very graciously, marches out into the aisle. I'm making none of this up. She marches out into the aisle. She turns back around to me and goes, Your Highness. To which, of course, being James, I said, and thank you very much. And then got into my seat. And I thought, my goodness, people are getting childish on this plane. Wasn't 3 more minutes. And she goes and sits in the aisle seat, right? And turns out that wasn't her seat either. She had the cheap middle seat. She hadn't paid squat for her ticket hardly. And she was just hoping nobody would be there. That's what she told the person across the aisle, who turned out to be a foreigner. He was Chinese and he couldn't speak English, so he didn't even know what she was saying, but I caught on. Then another lady comes in and says to the guy who doesn't understand English, oh, I'm sorry, you have my seat. And he's saying, and motioning and everything else, and he's looking at his ticket and looking at he was right, by the way. And he's looking at the ticket. And she goes, oh, I'm sorry, you probably don't speak English, but that's a C, and has him moved to her seat. By the time the plane took off, I was about ready to get up and preach repentance and everything, I was like, let's just down this thing in the ocean. We need some baptizing right here, right now. I was ready to get the rafts out. It was good. Crazy. But people have their selfishness wrapped up in where they sit. They have pride wrapped up in where they sit. And all those kinds of things. And it's embarrassing when you have to be corrected. So she says, you know what? If you don't try to pull a fast one, if you're not selfish, and if you're not prideful, you know what doesn't happen? You don't get embarrassed. Why put yourself through that? There's no reason to do that. So just don't. You don't have to embarrass yourself. Just don't. Don't embarrass yourself. Instead, get a bonus. If you end up in a bad seat, and the host comes up to you and says, no, actually, you belong over here, then that's actually a good thing, is it not? That's a better thing. So let yourself be honored in a way that's legitimate. When you try to steal it, that's going to blow up in your face someday. And you're going to end up finding shame. So why do that? And that seems just like good, practical, superficial advice. But it's not all there is to it. It's not just good, practical advice. Instead, there is a context. We've been talking about the importance of context of these parables. And I purposely skipped it for you. Let's go back to verse 1 and see where were they. I mentioned it was a dinner party, but where were they? This won't be up on the screen. One Sabbath, when they went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, so probably a pretty nice home, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. If you're not familiar with dropsy, that is a disease that's it's a broad term. It's edema and different things like that. Things that cause swelling and problems and issues. I have a picture for you. I think I put it in the wrong place, so we'll see it here in a little bit. But he had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Weird question, right? But here's this guy. He says, so all of you guys, you're all experts. You're well versed in the law. Is it okay for me to heal on the Sabbath? And, it doesn't really get much of an answer. It says they remained silent. Then, this is verse 4, he took him and he healed him and he sent him on his way. Right there in the middle of it. He heals this man with this obvious ailment and disease. Sends him on his way. And then he looks at them and says, which of you, having a son, it's kind of funny that these are lumped in there all together, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull them out? Wouldn't you do something about this? Jesus uses that same question elsewhere, and he doesn't even use a son as an example. He says, you got an ox or a sheep or whatever. Who wouldn't help? I know it's the Sabbath, but you would help your son. Your son falls down a well, like that little girl out in Odessa a long, long time ago. Wouldn't you do something about that? You wouldn't say, oh, sorry, Ellie, it's a deep well, I know, but, I'll throw down some snacks. It's the Sabbath. You would do this? No, you wouldn't do this. You would rescue your son. Even if you had an ox that fell down. This is a pretty big well, by the way. I don't know if this is Jesus' sense of humor or what this is. But you've got the ox down there. Your Buick falls down the well. You're not going to pull it back up again? Of course you are. Even though it's the Sabbath, of course you would. And what is he saying? Don't you judge me. You're about to get all upset about what I'm doing here. Don't you judge me. Why? Isn't this guy with the disease even more important than the ox who would have gone down the well? Not more important than the son, but more important than an ox who went down the well? Well, of course, and you'd have done that. So what's your problem again? Why does he bring that up? In line with this parable he tells about the banquet. Why does he tell a parable about where you sit after healing on the Sabbath? It has something to do with this guy, right? Here they are, they're at this fancy dinner, and his story is about people invited to a fancy wedding feast. So that's a little bit awkward just by itself because it's not very subtle. Okay? You're going to know he's talking about you. And you've just had this event where somebody that you kind of just didn't think ought to be there was there. And sure, this man with the dropsy is not the person you want sitting right up there at the head table, right? He's got this obvious disease, and it's uncomfortable, and that's awkward, and he might not even have been invited because Luke tells us that Jesus was speaking to those who had been invited, implying there might have been some there who weren't. It happened pretty often in that time, in that culture, and as Jesus went from place to place, that people who weren't invited would come and they wouldn't eat, but they would kind of hang around and listen to what Jesus might have to say. They could just go in and out of these houses sometimes, and so they would do that. We would find that very impertinent. Sometimes they did too. You'll remember at Simon's house. That was probably the dinner, one or two dinners before this, that Jesus went to at a Pharisee's house. He was washing the feet. It's just awkward. They are hearing all this because they have been doing all this, right? They've been trying to find the chief seats. They were known for that. Jesus convicts them about this several times. You always care about where you sit. You always care about making sure that it's the prominent seat. Not a practical seat, a prominent seat. Because it's all about power. And it's all about pride. And it's all about the attention that you get being in those places. And that's the context of all this. And the problem with all this is that that's what they've been doing. And then he just throws a wrench in the whole seating plan. You know, when you're organizing a wedding, you have to figure out where everybody's going to sit. And one of the problems with it should be easy, right? You can do it however you want it. It ought to be that the bride can just say, well, they're going to sit here, and that would be fine. But what happens? You have the seat chart out there. And then future mother-in-law comes and sees the seating chart. And what does she do? Oh, that's a nice seating chart. Do you think maybe we could, now don't tell me this didn't happen at some of y'all's weddings, because I've done too many weddings. I know about this stuff. I was at a wedding one time where I thought I was going to have to kick the future mother-in-law clean out the building. This is how bad it was. The young lady, the bride, was deaf. And the future mother-in-law was taking advantage, so was her mother, taking advantage of that to make plans she couldn't hear and change decisions she had made. Okay, I don't even believe in purgatory, but they may do a vacation. Okay, that may happen. That's bad. Okay, that's really bad. These were those kind of people. And they've been fighting over where they're going to sit. And Jesus is like, I'm going to tell a story. And I want you to get that it's all about you. I want it to sound practical, but yeah, guys, we're talking about you. And I'm going to mess up your seating plan. Hey, brother, why don't you come up here for a second? And he calls this guy who would not have been very prominent in the room and says, so, is this the right day to heal this guy? Is this the right day? Is this the right time? Is this the right place? What do you think? Nobody answers. He said, well, I guess we can do it then. Go home, you're healed. And he was. And so what happens? A guy speaks up. Now, I told y'all before, every now and then these guys speak up and they sound all enthusiastic, but they do it at all the wrong times. This is one of those. Look at verse, where do I want to go? I just saw it. This happened to me on Thursday, where they moved a whole verse around on me in a thing, and it was there. I promise you, it was there, right there in the Bible, and I saw it before. Good night. Where did it go? Well, let's just pick up in verse 11, and we'll find it as long as we get there. He said to the man who had invited him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Here we are. When one of those who reclined at the table with him heard these things, he said to him, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. That sounds so spiritual, doesn't it? He's one of those guys. We're blessed. You know the guys I'm talking about. I talk about them all the time. Blessed are those who eat the bread in the kingdom of God. Right? We're one of those guys. And that always sounds so holy and spiritual. We in our culture, we value the people who sound fake and phony over the people who are real. We do. We value fake smiles over genuine reality. It's wrong, but it's done all the time. And we expect people to be fake for us and entertain us for them. And so he says, isn't it just great to be a Christian? It's just so wonderful. And that's his thing. And Jesus says, it's funny that you mentioned that. That's what happens every time, isn't it? Every time one of these guys speaks up like that, Jesus goes, well, funny thing, let me tell you another story. And so that's what he does. And he tells this main story that I wanted to get at this morning. So let's look at this real quick. He goes on with the story, verse 16. He says to him, a man once gave a great banquet. He invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a field, and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused. And another, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I must go examine them. Please have me excused. And another, I've married a wife, and therefore I can't come. So the servant came and reported these things to the master. And the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, go out quickly to the streets and lanes of the city and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and lame. And the servant said, sir, what you commanded has been done, and there's still room. And the master said to the servant, go out to the highways and the hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men that were invited shall taste my banquet. All right, let me jump ahead of this because we've done all that. I jumped ahead of myself. That's all right. By the way, this is the picture I was looking for. This is dropsy. You swell up and build up a fluid. You've known people who've had an issue like this. Have you been one of those people? And he heals it. Which then, you wonder, what did this look like? Is this like when you let out the air of a balloon really quick and he healed right there in front of you? Like, right up in there? Don't you wish you could? That'd just be awesome, wouldn't it? Anyway, I'm going to just jump. You can see what I did there? Y'all didn't know I could do that. Just jump right to this one. Because this is the part of the story. It's actually easier. It's the longest part of it, and it's the easy part. It says there was a king. He invited all kinds of his friends and his cohorts. He invited all the important people, the aristocrats. He invited the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin. He doesn't list those in his telling of the story, but he lists those in the telling of his story. Reading between the lines, he's talking about the people at this banquet, sitting at the tables in front of him. That king invited all the important people, and one by one, they just made excuses. They were the people who normally would have been at a banquet that was thrown by the king. Why would they not be there? But they're not there. One says, well, I bought oxen. It's like I bought a new tractor, I got to go try it out. The other one had another excuse, the other had another excuse, the other had another excuse. One after another. And we've all given those excuses, haven't we? We've all been there. We've done that. We've given them. We've heard them. We've been on both sides of that equation. We know what that's like. And the king was upset. Why wouldn't he be? It's an insult to the king. Trying out 5 new oxen is more important than seeing the king. How many things do we put in that blank? Blank is more important than our king. And so we miss a lot of opportunities. They missed an incredible banquet, but the banquet was still held. He says, well, you know what? This is what we're going to do. I want you to go out. I want you to invite the poor, the lame, the crippled, the blind. I want you to go get everybody you can. The downtrodden, all the people who were never invited. I want you to go invite them instead. You haul them in. And so his servant goes, and he does that, and he gathers in all of these people from the roads, and he comes back and he says, there's still more room. He's saying, go find more people. But we're not filling it in with those ingrates who knew better and who had been here before and who know what they're missing. Instead, you go out and find people who just didn't even know what they were missing. You bring them in. It's the man with the dropsy. He says, that guy I just healed, he now knows the true kingdom of God. He came to find healing, and he got it. The guy who says, isn't it great to be here? Maybe he was genuine. I don't know. But there were others in the room who should have known who they were in the presence of, but didn't. Isn't it wild when you consider that at their table was the King? The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Son of God was at their table. Knowing what had transpired in this meal, it'd be speculation a little bit, but knowing what's transpired in this meal, where do you think he was sitting? Knowing what he just taught, where do you think Jesus sat? And he was the real king. Truly, first came last. Last came first. And then he just calls everybody into that dinner and called them out so much as he calls them to a new way of thinking and behaving. He says, think of everybody else as more important than yourself. For Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the most important person in the room was that man with dropsy. It wasn't the Pharisee who was hosting. It wasn't the mayor who had made sure he jockeyed a seat close to the host. It wasn't the social climber. It wasn't the wealthy guy. It was this hurting man. Possibly a poor man. Where do you think Jesus sat? Go find a seat like Jesus' seat and sit there. Find somebody Jesus would sit next to and bless them and honor one another. Paul says in Romans 12, honor one another above yourselves. It's not just practical advice. This is the core teaching of the kingdom of God. Others are to be treated as more important than ourselves, and it frees you. It's so freeing not to worry about any of that stuff anymore, but to just go and love on people instead. Jesus is really teaching us a better way of life, isn't it? And it's not just a better way of life to make us feel better. It is the better way of the kingdom that brings honor and love and glory and healing to people indeed. If you need Jesus this morning, we offer every week, we offer an invitation that you can find healing in the waters of baptism, that you can have your sins washed away, His Spirit to come and live within you, and your eternity secure. So that's ready. And we are glad to celebrate that day with you if this is your day. If you need prayers, if maybe you're somebody that you feel like you've been bumped down the seat several times, but Jesus, you know, will call you into his kingdom. You need prayers about how to see all of that and how to experience all of that. He wants to pray with you. We'll pray with you. You need to come back here. We'll pray with you as a family. You can go back there. One of our elders will meet you there and pray with you there. But I encourage you, whatever you do, find somebody this week to honor above yourself and to bless beyond yourself in whatever way that you can and wherever you can. Let's stand and sing.